At the outbreak of the war between the states, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott was the commanding general of the United States Army, a position that he had held for almost 20 years. He was a hero of both the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. Scott was the one who taught future Civil War generals how to fight. Scott developed the Anaconda Plan, which was the first strategy implemented by the Union. The Anaconda Plan was a naval blockade of the Confederate States, which wrapped around the southern coastline and extended up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. The goals of the Anaconda Plan were to prevent goods from being imported and to prevent raw materials from being transferred across the Mississippi River. The Army and Navy had to work together to achieve this goal. Winfield Scott was born in 1786 in Virginia. His parents had passed away by the time he was 17 years old. They did not leave much in the way of inheritance, so he had to pull himself up by the old bootstraps of working his way through school. After obtaining a classical education in Richmond, he began studying law at the College of William and Mary. He did not stay long at the school and began an apprenticeship of law under a Virginia lawyer. The highlight of his time as a law student was getting to witness the trial of former Vice President Aaron Burr, who was on trial for treason. While Scott was admitted to the Virginia bar, his law practice was put on hold in 1808 when he obtained a commission as captain of light artillery in the United States Army. The light artillery was developed during the Napoleonic Wars. Up to that point, artillery was large guns used to knock down walls or shoot over your army at the opposing army. Napoleon wanted smaller artillery pieces that could easily be moved forward to fire the enemy as they moved across the battlefield. Scott became a student of Napoleon's strategies and tactics and would implement them in his campaigns. He also carried a military library with him while in the field. Scott's initial assignment was in New Orleans under the command of Brigadier General James Wilkinson, who would later court-martial him around 1810 for being rude to him. Scott's punishment for this crime was a 1-year suspension from the Army. Scott returned to duty in early 1811 with his old rank in the artillery. He had a few additional duties, which included serving on the staff of Brigadier General Wade Hampton, who had replaced Brigadier General Wilkinson, who had been fired for corruption. Scott's new boss decided that having a court-martial under his belt meant that Scott had the required expertise to serve on his staff, as well as performing judge-advocate duties. Approximately two-thirds of the Army was stationed at New Orleans under the command of General Hampton, who was preparing for an attack by Great Britain. It was at this time that Congress started to be concerned about the northern border, which actually had British troops on the other side. So in January of 1812, when Congress authorized a larger army for the coming war, General Hampton was transferred to the Canadian border area of America. Scott was brought along to be his aide, but there was a change of plans. Captain Scott was promoted to lieutenant colonel and appointed second in command of an artillery regiment under the command of Colonel George Izard. For a while, Scott was transferred from one command to another, with the highlight of this period being when he led an expedition to capture a docked British warship. Once the Americans had command of the ship, they set it on fire and sent it down the Niagara River. After that, Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer organized an expedition against Queenston. The army of 3,000 launched its attack across the river from Louisburg. Future Civil War generals that fought along Scott were Captain John Wool and Lieutenant John Adams Dix. The battle wasn't going well for the Americans until Lieutenant Colonel Scott led reinforcements across the river. With the fresh troops, the Americans were able to fight the British to a stalemate. Then reinforcements showed up for the Brits. The Americans then ran out of ammunition and eventually had to surrender, but not before some of them could escape back across the river. Scott was leading the effort to continue the fight, much like a rear guard, which allowed much of this army to be saved. Eventually, Scott would be captured. Scott's 2 months as a prisoner of war was during a time period when captured officers were treated more like guests than prisoners, which is why Scott was given a room at a local tavern. His days at the tavern were for the most part uneventful until two natives, who were still upset about the battle, showed up to kill him. He put a pretty good whipping on both of them until a British officer put an end to it. Lieutenant Colonel Scott was returned to Washington in January 1813. This was in time for Congress to authorize 20 more regiments, 6 new brigadier and major generals. Scott's commander, Colonel Izard, was promoted to brigadier general, and Scott was promoted to colonel and took command of the regiment. As a colonel, Scott took part in the Battle of Fort George and cleared the Niagara frontier of British and Canadian troops. After the 1813 campaign season was over, the War Department began removing the older generals from service. Whether this was due to them not sending in their 5 weekly accomplishments to Doge or their incompetencies, we may never know. This created room for the younger, more successful officers to move up in rank. The new major generals were Jacob Brown, George Izard, and Andrew Jackson. The new brigadier generals were Edmund Gaines, Alexander McComb, Eleazar Ripley, and Winfield Scott. Scott would command a brigade in Brown's army. This leads us to the battles of Chippewa and Lundy's Lane. The Battle of Chippewa was the coming of the storm that would be Lundy's Lane. The two lead elements of the opposing armies would clash on July 5, 1814. Brigadier General Winfield Scott would defeat British Major General Phineas Riall in this battle. The British would fall back to Lundy's Lane to await reinforcements. Scott arrived with his brigade at Lundy's Lane on July 25th. His brigade consisted of the 9th, 11th, 22nd, and 25th Infantry Regiments, along with an artillery battery. The 25th was placed in reserve. Scott had led his brigade into a trap. Riall had been reinforced by Lieutenant General Gordon, who had placed his troops on a hill. Scott ordered his troops forward, and they took a beating from the British. They could not advance past the fence railing. While the American attack came to a standstill, Scott sent the 25th Regiment, commanded by Major Thomas Jessup, on a flanking attack. Jessup and the 25th made a surprise attack on a mounted unit, capturing most of this unit along with Major General Riall. Scott was able to pull his main attack force back to the starting point. Out of the original 1,300 troops, he only had 400 effectives left. Scott organized the remaining troops into 2 battalions commanded by Majors Henry Leavenworth and Thomas Jessup. At this point, Major General Jacob Brown arrived to the battle with the rest of his army. Brown placed Scott's troops in reserve and planned for the next attack. Brown's army consisted of 2 more regiments. The 21st Regiment, commanded by Colonel James Miller, would take the left of the field, with the 23rd Regiment, commanded by Brigadier General Willock Ripley, would take the right of the field. As they advanced, the 21st fixed bayonets, fired a volley, then charged. The British line broke, and the troops retreated to a safer place. As the Americans were positioning their guns along with the captured British guns, Drummond made a counterattack with his troops and reinforcements. While the counterattack failed, Scott had been riding through the field during this time to find a spot to commit his remaining troops. Scott was hit in the shoulder with a 1-ounce ball that shattered the bone. He had to be carried from the field. The war was essentially over for Scott. After General Brown was wounded, he ordered his army to withdraw from the field. The protocol of the day was that the army remaining on the field after the battle was the winner. However, both armies left the field at the same time. Drummond did return to the field first to collect wounded and supplies. This allowed the British to claim a technical victory. Regardless if it was a win, loss, or draw for either side, the Battle of Lundy's Lane stopped the American invasion of Canada. The army stayed in the area for a few days with minor contact. Brigadier General Edmund Gaines, the commander of Brown's 4th Brigade, arrived to take control of the army. During this time, Gaines led the Americans to victory over the British, who had attacked their supply depot at Fort Erie. During this battle, Gaines was wounded and brevetted to Major General. Even though Scott was also brevetted to Major General for his actions at Lundy's Lane, Gaines had stole the spotlight from him at Fort Erie. This would lead to a meaningless feud between the two men for the next few decades. Scott was placed in command of the new 10th Military District, which covered Maryland, the District of Columbia, and Northern Virginia. This district was created after the British burnt the White House. Having a national hero such as Scott in charge of the defenses of the area provided much-needed comfort for the government and the civilian population. There were brief talks of Congress bringing back the rank of Lieutenant General, a rank that had not been held since George Washington. The top contenders for the new rank were Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans, Jacob Brown, and Winfield Scott. This plan was tossed aside when Congress decided to reduce the size of the Army from 65,000 to 10,000 troops. Scott was appointed to the Military Reduction Board and served as its chairman. After the Army was reduced in size, Scott took a 3-year military tour of Europe to inspect European military affairs. Upon his return, he found that the Army had divided the country into 2 divisions, with the Northern Division under the command of Jacob Brown and the Southern Division under the command of Andrew Jackson. The 3rd Major General in the Army, George Izard, was discharged in June 1815. Scott was given command of the 3rd Department Northern Division, which covered New York and Niagara. For most of Scott's career, his headquarters was located in New York City. During this time, Scott developed the General Regulations for Army Administration, which he titled Military Institutes. In 1821, Congress reduced the size of the Army again, going from 2 Major Generals down to 1, and going from 4 Brigadier Generals down to 2. Jackson resigned to become governor of Florida. Jacob Brown was named the commanding general of the Army. Up until Brown's appointment as the commanding general, the Army did not have an overall commander. There was a position of senior officer, which was the highest ranking officer in the Army. The senior officer did not necessarily have command authority over officers commanding other departments, unless there was a difference in rank. By establishing the office of commanding general, the Army refined the command structure, which was an important step into developing it into a professional permanent Army. Regarding the 4 Brigadier Generals, Alexander McClellan accepted an offer and reduction of rank to colonel. In return, he would command the Corps of Engineers. This would allow both Gaines and Scott to keep their ranks of Brigadier General. Ellsworth Ripley was not consulted in this arrangement, so he resigned in protest. Even though McClellan was demoted, the benefit for him is that he would have a stable life with little travel away from his post. On February 24, 1828, Major General Jacob Brown passed away. Both Gaines and Scott were the leading candidates to fill the vacancy. After all, they were the only 2 Brigadier Generals in the Army, both having a brevet as Major General. Having a brevet rank was essentially extra points when calculating the score of whether or not someone should be promoted to a new permanent rank. With 1 vacancy and 2 candidates, this is where that meaningless feud intensifies. The 2 candidates got into a public argument over who should be promoted. They used the newspapers to insult each other while promoting themselves. The contest eventually disgusted President John Quincy Adams to the point that he bypassed both men and promoted Colonel Alexander McClellan to Major General in the office of Commanding General. Having a brevet of Major General of his own made this decision easier for the President. Things were quiet for Scott until the Black Hawk War of 1831. Apparently the war was taking longer than the President wanted, so he gave Scott orders to take command of the war. Scott led troops to the location, but they all got sick on the boat, all except for Joseph E. Johnston. This was Scott's first encounter with Johnston, and he left quite an impression. When Scott arrived at Zachary Taylor's camp, the war had already ended. During the nullification crisis, Scott was ordered to Charleston to reinforce Fort Moultrie and Castle Pinckney. His first order of business was to establish good relations with the prominent citizens and use his status as a national hero to pacify the crisis. This would not be the last time that Scott would use his status to avoid war. While leading this effort, Scott was impressed by 2nd Lieutenant Erasmus D. Keyes, who he would bring onto the staff of the Eastern Department as a military aide. Keyes would serve much of his career under Scott. This experience that Keyes gained while serving as Scott's aide is what led President Lincoln to choose Keyes to be one of his first Corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac and the Union Army. During the Second Seminole War, their various commanders rotated in and out of service. Typically, a commander would fail at winning the war, or more important duty would call, so the general in charge would receive orders to the new assignment. Florida at this time was not the vacation spot that we know it as today. North Florida and the coast were the places that Americans lived, and that was considered the frontier. The blue area on the map was a reservation reserved for the Seminoles, which was a collection of small-sized tribes from around the southeast that fled to that area. In 1836, Winfield Scott got his chance to lead an expedition against the Seminoles. This area was actually under the command of Scott's old nemesis, Brevet Major General Edmund Gaines. But Gaines was recalled from Florida back to New Orleans to gather a force to occupy the Louisiana-Texas border. This was when the Texas Revolution was going on. The president wanted an army in that region so that hostilities or a foreign army could not cross the border. This brings us to Scott and his campaign in Florida. His army was divided up into 3 wings or columns. Each would march toward the Seminole camp. The intent was that if the 3 columns closed in at the same time, then the Seminoles would be captured or destroyed. The plan was being set into motion until General Gaines showed up with his occupation force and hijacked Scott's campaign. Gaines led a single column toward the Seminole camp. This allowed the Seminoles to escape to fight another day. Scott's campaign being ruined, there were no charges brought against Gaines for his interference. It was looked at as nothing more than another episode in the never-ending feud between the 2 generals. That's when Scott was given new orders. The preparation for what would be known as the Trail of Tears was almost ready. The Army decided that Scott, as a major general, should be given command of this endeavor. However, things weren't going smoothly. The Cherokees in Georgia were putting up a little resistance, as well as the Creeks in Alabama. It didn't help that the whites in the area were antagonizing the natives and stealing from them every chance that they got. Scott had to use the full force of the United States Army to get the natives in line. He called upon his old battle buddy from Lundy's Lane, Thomas Jessup, who was now a brigadier general and the quartermaster general of the Army, to take command in Alabama. They were going to execute a similar move as planned in Florida. However, the Alabama militia jumped the gun and went after the Creeks before all the elements of the Army were ready to move. To make the best of a bad military situation, General Jessup took to the field, took command of the Alabamians, and won a couple of battles. Losing control of his men led to a rebuke by mail from Major General Scott. Jessup replied by mail to explain the situation. The 2 wrote back and forth, often replying to a letter that was outdated. The conversation turned nasty quickly. To smooth things over, Brigadier General Jessup decided that the best course of action would be to take the argument to the newspapers. This led to Scott being relieved of command and called back to Washington. When he arrived in Washington, hoping to clear his name, everyone above him in the chain of command was nowhere to be found. This frustrated Scott, which led to more complaining in the newspapers. Eventually, the president called a court of inquiry to determine exactly what happened. A court of inquiry is when an official military court convenes to investigate a matter. Even though it is not a court-martial where charges are pressed, disciplinary actions can come about if the court warrants it so. While the court was initially called to investigate the actions of Scott and Jessup, President Jackson added Gaines to the mix since he was upset over his actions in Florida. The court turned political and the president did not like their findings, so he tossed the whole thing out. Scott, Jessup, and Gaines were all exonerated. On June 29, 1841, Major General McClellan passed away, leaving the position of commanding general vacant. Scott was appointed to fill this vacancy, a position that he would hold until he retired during the Civil War. Things were relatively quiet as commanding general until President Polk annexed Texas. War with Mexico was imminent. Polk needed someone to take command of troops close to the border. Polk did not go to Scott for advice on how to proceed with an imminent war with Mexico. Polk did not trust military officers, and Scott did not trust militia, which put Scott at odds with Polk's plans. President Polk bypassed Major General Scott and appointed Brevet Brigadier General Zachary Taylor to take command of what would be called the Army of Occupation, which would sit in the disputed border zone and be fired upon, which would start a war, essentially a false flag event. From there, Taylor would lead a 3-division army, which would invade Mexico from the north. Taylor had great success and a promotion to Major General. He was becoming a national hero. The fame was an issue for Polk, a Democrat, who believed that Taylor was being set up as a presidential contender for the Whigs. To prevent Taylor from gaining any more fame and momentum, Polk decided to open up a second front in the war, which would invade from Vera, Cruz. Taylor was bypassed for this command. Scott was ignored since he was a Whig, and no other general was a good fit for this new command. Polk acted upon Missouri Senator Thomas Benton's request for the new command. The president asked Congress to create a special lieutenant generalcy for Senator Benton, but Congress declined the request. It turned out that the only choice that the president had was to appoint Scott to command the Southern invasion force. Scott's invading force was largely made up of Taylor's army from the Northern campaign. But before we get into the structure of this new army, no Mexican-American war story can take place without the telling of this story. When the Navy showed up outside of Vera, Cruz, Scott went out on a rowboat to scout for a landing site for his army. He had much of his engineering staff with him. The boat got too close to the fort at Vera Cruz, which started firing cannonballs at it. If it had been hit, not only would Major General Scott have been killed, but so would Captains Robert E. Lee and Joseph Johnston, and Lieutenants George Meade and P.G.T. Beauregard, all of which were Army commanders in the Civil War. Once a landing site was chosen, Major General Scott chose Major General Worth's 1st Division to act as the vanguard for the invasion. Worth's 1st Brigade under the command of Colonel John Garland consisted of the 2nd Artillery, which acted as infantry, along with the 3rd and 8th Infantry Regiments. They would make the initial movement inland to establish the line of investment and begin the siege. The 2nd Brigade of Worth's 1st Division, under the command of Colonel Newman S. Clark, consisted of the 5th, 6th, and 8th Infantry Regiments. The 2nd Brigade moved inland to take its place on the line. Clark positioned his brigade to cover 2 of the roads going to the fort, which also gave him control of one of the fort's water supplies. Major General Robert Patterson's 3rd Division, made up of militia, moved into place next. The 3rd Brigade, under the command of Brigadier General James Shields, made up of the 3rd and 4th Illinois, set up on the other side of the creek, which allowed him to control the last road in the area that leads to the fort. After that, Brigadier General Gideon Pillow, of Fort Donelson fame, moved his 2nd Brigade, consisting of the 1st and 2nd Tennessee and 1st and 2nd Pennsylvania regiments, to cover the area on the other side of Shields all the way to the other creek. With this movement, Scott's army could cut off all of the water going to the fort. Brigadier General John Quitman's 1st Brigade, consisting of the 2nd New York and a South Carolinian regiment, took position on the other side of the creek. The 2nd Division, under the command of Major General David Twiggs, moved into position on the far side of the field. Colonel Bennett Riley's 2nd Brigade, consisting of the 2nd and 7th Infantry Regiments, along with the 4th Artillery, took position to the right of the road. Brigadier General Percival F. Smith's 1st Brigade, consisting of the Mounted Riflemen and 1st Artillery, both serving as infantry, along with the 3rd Infantry and a light battery, set up position on the road facing the fort. Colonel William Harney's Dragoon Brigade, consisting of 3 regiments that were led by Captain Philip Kearny, Major Edwin V. Sumner, and Colonel Edward Butler, were stationed to the southeast. They were there to reinforce infantry units being attacked, act as scouts, and move against any reinforcements coming to break the siege. Artillery batteries were set facing the fort. They would be there to knock down the walls of the fort. Adjacent batteries were set up covering the road in case Mexican infantry broke through the other artillery and tried to fight their way out of the siege. The American artillery was ineffective against the walls of the fort. Scott had the Navy take its large guns off the ships and set up facing the fort. The larger guns had more firepower and would knock down the walls of the fort. This action must have made an impression on a young Ulysses S. Grant, because he would do the same thing at the end of the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. Once the fort fell and the Americans took control of it, they needed to set off on the national road to Mexico City. But first, Scott had a few side quests to complete. The first was assuring the Mexicans that the war was not a war upon them as a people. It was merely a military conflict. The second being to hang some soldiers that were convicted of raping a few Latinas. Brigadier General John Quitman was left in charge at Vera Cruz. Keeping control of the city would ensure a base of operations was on the coast, which allowed them to establish a supply line going inland. Major General David Twiggs led the vanguard of the army down the national road, with Patterson and Worth following behind. The Americans set up camp not too far from the town of Cerro Gordo, where Santa Anna had his army waiting for the Americans. On the day of the battle, Major General Worth had yet to arrive, leaving Scott with only 4 infantry divisions, some artillery, and dragoons to fight a larger force. Patterson was on quarters due to being sick, so he would not be an active participant in the activities. Also, Brigadier General Smith was sick, so his brigade would be commanded by Colonel Harney. The battle plan was based off of scouting reports from the Corps of Engineers, specifically Captain Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Beauregard. The various elements of the Army would be led to their attack sites by the engineers. Most of the Army, 3 divisions, would go on a wide flanking attack, while 1 division would perform a frontal assault. This style of flanking attack, which isolates part of the opposing army, is a lesson that was better learned by the Southerners than the Northerners, which we will see years later in the Civil War. With a division of Twiggs in place, Riley was supposed to conduct the main assault against the battery located in the rear of the enemy formation. Shields would conduct a flanking attack, with Harney placed in reserves. As Shields advanced, the Mexican cavalry retreated along with the infantry reserves. Riley's brigade was able to capture the artillery battery, and Captain John McGruder turned the guns on the supporting infantry brigade, causing them to retreat across the creek and from the field. Twiggs orders Harney to attack the other artillery battery, which prevented a counterattack on Ripley's brigade. While that was going on, Pillow was on the other side of the field using his military expertise to take the wrong path to conduct his frontal assault. His troops were exposed to the enemy fire sooner than they should have been, causing many casualties. Pillow himself was wounded, and the command structure of the brigade collapsed to the point of the regiments acting as individual units. Back on the other side of the field, Twiggs and his division was able to refocus and concentrate their attention on the enemy rear, which led to the Mexican surrendering. The stats for the battle show 63 Americans being killed and over 300 wounded, and the Mexicans having over 1,000 killed and over 3,000 taken prisoner. As Santa Anna retreated toward Mexico City with what remained of his army, Major General Patterson pursued with his division to the town of Jalapa, while the rest of the army buried the dead and gathered supplies. The service time with volunteers under Patterson expired in May of 1847, which reduced the size of the army by 7 regiments, which was approximately 7,000 soldiers. Later in the year, replacements would arrive, with Pillow returning with 4,500 soldiers and Franklin Pierce bringing 2,400 soldiers. Scott's new army consisted of 4 divisions. Worth's division of 2 brigades included 6 regiments. Twiggs's division of 2 brigades included 6 regiments. Pillow's division of 2 brigades included 5 regiments. And Quitman's division of 2 brigades included 3 regiments, and Harney's brigade of dragoons. Major General Winfield Scott began his final push toward Mexico City in August of 1847. He arrived in St. Augustine on August 15th. Mexican troops were located throughout the area. Scott would attack the isolated armies one at a time, then attack Mexico City. This strategy would prevent his army from being attacked in the rear as he advanced toward Mexico City. Just north of the town of Contreras was a Mexican army under the command of former Mexican President General Gabriel Valencia. Valencia positioned his 4,500 troops and guns just north of where the St. Augustine Road intersects with the Contreras Road. This location was a great defensive position that would give Scott very little room to maneuver his troops. In such a tight space to attack, Scott's numbers would be negated as the Americans would run into a wall of lead. If there was an attempt to move north, the reserve unit could move to block the road. The Pedregal area was a dried-up lava bed that would protect the Mexicans from a flank attack because it was impassable, at least until Scott had Major Robert E. Lee build a road through it, which allowed the American army to conduct another flanking movement. General Pillow provided the men to perform the labor of building Lee's road. Once the road was built, a reconnaissance effort was to be made, not a general engagement. Twiggs was sent to the front of the road-building operation to protect from any attack that might happen to the troops as they built the road. The Americans got close to the Mexicans, who began firing upon them. Twiggs was reluctant to counterattack, so Pillow sent Major John Magruder to lead an artillery battery to fire upon the Mexicans. The Americans were outgunned and their artillery was taken out. Pillow then sent a couple of companies of mounted riflemen to make an attack, but they got stuck between the Mexican force and the American artillery and would have to wait it out. That's when Pillow sent Riley's brigade around the Mexican flank. Eventually Cadwalder, then Smith would make their advances and join Riley. With the 3 brigades undetected and hidden from the Mexican army, General Smith took command of the force and sent Major Lee back to Scott with a plan to attack in the morning. Scott discussed this plan with Lee and the division commanders. The main attack would be Smith's force attacking the rear of the Mexican army, with a diversionary attack on the Mexican front by Brigadier General Franklin Pierce. Brigadier General Shields would be positioned north of the battle to clash with any Mexican reinforcements that would arrive. While the Americans were preparing for the attack, the Mexicans spent the night celebrating what they thought had been a huge victory. When 6 a.m. rolled around, the Americans attacked. The slaughter lasted only 17 minutes. Out of the 4,500 Mexicans at the battle, 700 were killed, over 1,200 were wounded, and around 850 were captured. The rest of the Mexican army managed to escape. The Mexican troops at San Antonio had fallen back to Churubusco, which meant that Worth could advance to the next destination with fresh troops. There, Scott's army found that Mexicans had a sizable force at the Bridge Point and at the San Mateo Convent. Scott divided his army into 3 sections. Twiggs would attack the convent with his division. Worth and Pillow would attack the bridge with their divisions. Quitman's division was in reserve protecting the supplies. The 2 fighting sections would attack at the same time. The Mexicans had a larger force at the bridge, which is why more troops were sent there. If this force was captured, then the convent would be cut off from reinforcements and possibly escape. After the battle had went on a while, Pierce was pulled away from the attack to join Shields in a flanking maneuver to cut off a potential retreat. Just north of the river, the 2 brigades discovered another Mexican force and they started fighting. At this point, there were 3 isolated fights in the city. The Mexicans at the bridge were defeated first, with some retreating back to Mexico City. The divisions of Clark and Cadwater joined the fight against the convent. After it fell, reinforcements were sent north to help Shields clear the town of the final troops. After the Battle of Churubusco, negotiations were held between Mexico and America on how to end the war. General Scott felt that Santa Anna was using the negotiations to buy time to prepare for a counterattack. Part of these preparations were using the cannon foundry at Molina del Ray to make some new cannons. Scott decided to make his next move, which brings us to the town of Molina del Ray and the surrounding area. Brigadier General Oaxa had a brigade at Molina del Ray. Brigadier General Perez had a brigade at Casa Mata. Brigadier General Ramirez had a brigade between the two, and Brigadier General Bravo had just over 800 infantry at Chapultepec. General Alvarez had 4,000 cavalry in reserve at Hacienda Morales. On the day of the battle, the Mexican forces moved up to the road with the 2 brigades by Casa de Mata and the 3rd Brigade on the south side of Molina del Ray. Starting on the American side of the field, from right to left is a battery commanded by Captain Drum of the 4th Artillery, Brigadier General Garland commanding his brigade of infantry, Colonel Charles Ferguson Smith commanding a light battalion of infantry, and the 8th Infantry commanded by Major George Wright. Captain Benjamin Huger of the Ordnance Department commanded an artillery battery that supported this group on the left side of the formation. On the left of the field was a brigade commanded by Colonel James McIntosh. Brevet Colonel James Duncan commanded the artillery that supported McIntosh. Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Edwin V. Sumner commanded 3 squadrons of dragoons. Brigadier General George Cadwallader's brigade was placed in reserves. As the fighting commenced, McIntosh was at a standstill against the Mexicans at Casa de Mata. Garland's wing of the attack was able to move forward. With Drum's battery firing at the flank and Huger's attacking the front, this allowed the infantry to move forward. Garland moved on the flank as Smith and Wright attacked the front. This part of the Mexican force collapsed first. The Mexican cavalry reserves came down the road to assist in the battle. Part of Duncan's artillery repositioned to face the new threat, while Sumner led his dragoons to meet them. This stopped the first cavalry charge. Back on the other side of the field, Garland's wing was able to regroup after their success and move on the Mexicans around Casa de Mata. This proved to be too much for these troops. While that was going on, the Mexican cavalry tried another charge, only to be met with overwhelming artillery fire. With the Mexican infantry units having been defeated and the Mexican cavalry not able to withstand the artillery, the battle was over. All of the Mexican survivors that had not been captured fell back to Mexico City. There was still a small regiment left in the town of Chapultepec. Worth's division just went through a tough battle and took more casualties than expected, so they were in no condition to make the attack. Pillow's division had arrived with reinforcements from Quitman's division. Together they stormed the city. After Chapultepec, Scott's army surrounded Mexico City and took it. The army moved into the city to formally accept their surrender. Mexican politicians were impressed with Scott and asked him to take control of the country as a dictator for a period of 4 to 6 years while they are able to put everything back together. Scott declined the invitation. Things were quiet for the commanding general into the mid-1850s when Jefferson Davis became Secretary of War. Up until that point, the commanding general answered directly to the president. The staff officers answered to the Secretary of War, who then reported to the president. The Secretary of War was not in the chain of command regarding field operations. Davis changed this, which caused friction with Scott. On March 7, 1855, Scott was appointed the rank of brevet lieutenant general, with all pay and allowances backdated to March 29, 1847, the day that Vera Cruz surrendered. Davis did everything in his power to stop this from happening, but Scott prevailed. Jumping forward to the late 1850s, Scott's relationship with President Buchanan and Secretary of War John Floyd fell apart. This was largely due to Buchanan's handling of Bloody Kansas and not allowing Scott to march the army into Kansas and squash the whole thing. Scott moved the Army headquarters from New York City, which was the location for most of Scott's time as commanding general, to Washington, D.C. He felt it was important to be in Washington since the country was going through a rough time. Being in Washington allowed Scott to personally appoint Robert E. Lee to handle the John Brown affair at Harper's Ferry. Scott did leave briefly to go to the West Coast to squash the pig war with England and Canada before it got out of hand. Brigadier General Harney was using Captain Pickett to instigate a war over a disputed grazing area for pigs. Harney's logic was that if the country united together to fight for the pigs, this would distract from internal problems, but Scott used his reputation to smooth things over and prevent a needless war. On June 10, 1860, Brevet Major General Thomas Jessup passed away. This is the same Jessup that fought under Scott at Lundy's Lane, and he had the newspaper argument back in the 30s. With the passing of Jessup, the position of Quartermaster General was vacant. This position held the permanent rank of Brigadier General. Buchanan and Floyd asked Scott for a recommendation to fill this vacancy. Scott's reply was that he would not recommend one person because Buchanan and Floyd go against everything that he recommends. He does not want to harm this person's career by providing a recommendation. So he would list the top 4 officers in the Army that were not a regular general. The officers were Albert Sidney Johnston, Brevet Brigadier General, with the regular rank of Colonel. Served as the Major General in the Army of Texas and the Texan Secretary of War. Commanded the 2nd Cavalry and the Departments of Texas and Utah. Currently en route to take command of the Department of the Pacific. Robert E. Lee, Brevet Colonel with the regular rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Served for years as an engineer, was on Scott's staff during the Mexican-American War, Superintendent of West Point, Commander of the 2nd Cavalry in the Department of Texas. Joseph E. Johnston, Brevet Colonel with the regular rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Served as a topographical engineer, served on Scott's staff during the Mexican-American War, second in command of the 1st Cavalry, just finished diplomatic duties to Mexico. Charles Ferguson Smith, Brevet Colonel with regular rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Artillery instructor at West Point, Artillery and Infantry Regiment Commander during the Mexican-American War, second in command of the 10th Infantry Regiment, currently serving as commander of the Department of Utah. These 4 men were considered by the rank and file and Scott to be the top 4 officers outside of the general officers in the United States Army. With this list, Buchanan and Floyd had Scott's recommendation. They decided to promote Brevet Colonel Joseph Johnston to the position of Quartermaster General with the rank of Brigadier General. This list is important during the secession crisis, so we'll come back to it in a few minutes. As the lower South left the Union and formed the Confederacy, there are 4 forts left in Union control. Of the 2 that mattered, they were Fort Pickens in Florida and Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. Artillery troops were transferred to Fort Moultrie, and the officers present were Captains Abner Doubleday and Theodore Seymour, and Lieutenant Jefferson C. Davis. As the troop buildup was growing into an artillery battalion, with combat action very likely, Scott sent Major Robert Anderson to take command. Anderson's instructions were to hold the fort. Anderson moved to Fort Sumter because it would be easier to defend. Scott was advising Buchanan to hold the fort. Once Lincoln took office, Scott reversed his decision and advised Lincoln to abandon the fort. The new president wanted to know why Scott reversed his decision, but he could not come up with a reason. This was the first sign that his old age was interfering with the job. It is also when Scott began to lose influence with Lincoln. After the Confederates took Fort Sumter, Lincoln called up an army to squash the rebellion. This is where we return to that list. At the beginning of the succession crisis, the army had 4 generals in the field. Major General David Twiggs, who we last saw in the Mexican-American War. He was kicked out of the army for treason. The treason being that he handed the Department of Texas over to the Texans. Major General John Wool was 2 years older than Scott and was not fit for field command. Brigadier General William Harney was in command of the Department of the West. He was occupied with attempting to keep the peace, which would cost him his command. Brigadier General Edwin V. Sumner had just received his promotion to replace Twiggs, and was sent to the Department of the Pacific to replace Albert Sidney Johnston as commander of that department. Scott offered to promote Albert Sidney Johnston to Major General and make him the number 2 ranking person in the Army, which meant he would be the commanding general. He left for the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee was offered a promotion to Major General along with the command of the army that would march south to squash the rebellion. He left to side with Virginia, then the Confederacy. Joseph Johnston was not offered a command. The reason that he took the Quartermaster General position was that it was a stable assignment that finally allowed him to work from home and be with his wife. Scott felt that this was Johnston's driving motivation and merely offered to leave him alone if he stayed in the Union Army. Johnston's wife did advise Scott that he would not be able to sit on the sidelines during this war. It did not occur to Scott that Johnston might want a command in the Union Army. He left for Virginia and then the Confederacy. Charles Ferguson Smith was passing through Washington for another assignment, but Scott put him in charge of the defenses of Washington. Smith would not talk to the reporters, so they spread rumors about him being drunk on duty and secretly working with Confederates. This caused him to be relieved of his duties. With that, Scott was not able to obtain the services of the most qualified men in the Army. Many of the colonels throughout the Army were of old age and not fit for duty. There were some who were still available to serve in the field, but they were out west. Many of the lieutenant colonels were also fit and worthy of command, but again, they were out west. Major Irvin McDowell, who was a supply troop, he was the only available officer that could take command of the army and march south to squash the rebellion. McDowell and the Secretary of War were developing plans for the new army, but Scott had different plans. He wanted a part of the regular army to be set aside and not mix in with the volunteer army or even fight in the war. McDowell and the Secretary of War thought that Scott had lost his mind, and they quit consulting with him regarding any plans. After the disaster at Manassas, Lincoln placed George McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac. When he met with Scott, Scott gave him some petty errands to run. McClellan disregarded them and began building the army and training it. It didn't take long for Mac to cut Scott out of all communications. In fact, everyone started doing this. Scott could not stay awake during the meetings he did attend. Before Scott retired, he was able to make 2 very important contributions to the war effort. The first is that he developed the Anaconda Plan. It was actually the Navy's idea to blockade the eastern and southern coastlines. Scott advised that they extend the blockade up the Mississippi River, then the Ohio River. Having control of the Mississippi River would cut the Confederacy in half. Having control of the Ohio River, that would give access to the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, which would allow the Union to ship troops and supplies into the heart of the Confederacy. The second was to appoint Henry Halleck to the rank of Major General in the regular army. This made Halleck the 3rd highest ranking person serving in the war. He would become the commanding general within a year. His nickname was Old Brains. He had written the Manual for Strategic Warfare. His strategy is what led the Union to victory. Lieutenant General Winfield Scott offered his letter of resignation on October 31st, 1861. President Lincoln and his cabinet unanimously agreed to accept the resignation. He departed Washington with a military farewell on November 2nd. Scott would return to make an appearance at Washington in 1862 and again recommend that Henry Halleck be appointed to the position of commanding general, which Lincoln did agree to. Scott passed away on May 30th, 1866. He was laid to rest in West Point Cemetery. The pallbearers included Ulysses S. Grant, George Meade, George Thomas, John Schofield, Oliver Howard, and Admiral David Farragut.